expert's address, sir, you mentioned that there's a different energy in India and people need to look afresh. I think they do need to look no further than you to get an exemplification of the kind of new energy that's visible. If I can quickly do an audience poll, not the official one with the timers or with the remote in your hand, just a show of hands. How many of you believe that the narrative has changed for the better as far as manufacturing is concerned in India since Make in India has been launched? Is there a better buzz? I think it's a decent majority. Just to clarify, how many of you believe there's been no change since the launch of Make in India? Just to make sure that you're not being... They're very scared of you, sir, so they're not raising their hand. No, I think clearly we all would agree that the narrative has changed. The energy seems to be very different. All the measures that you said on change in the ease of business, I think rings true. Clearly a lot of things happening. Now what I'm going to do is, with each of our corporate experts here, three of you, neither of you are new to India. You've been manufacturing in India, you've been operating in India for a while now. I'd like your perspective individually on what you think has been the change since Make in India came about, since the past. Has it really changed for you on the ground? Are there stories that sort of resonate with what Mr. Kant just mentioned in terms of ease of business actually improving? Specifically at the state level, the point about competition that Mr. Kant mentioned, is that ringing true as well? And I'm also going to ask you to top it up with what your major areas of concern or suggestions would be in regard with this entire Make in India program. Can I start with you, Mr. Sondhi?
Yeah, do you want to go one by one or take everything together?
Your choice.
Yeah.
Let's take it.
Well, I certainly subscribe to this, that the narrative, not only in India, but in other parts of the world is changed. But what's extremely important is to understand that there were very high expectations when the government came in. And perhaps there is a feeling that delivery is not adequate. Now that we've got to distinguish between the political rhetoric and what is actually realistically possible on the ground. So I have to concur with Mr. Amitabh Kant that this is a work in progress of which is going to happen on a sustained basis. The underlying part is that we must sustain this. But in the last 15 months, I haven't seen more government activity now taking place on economic issues as perhaps over the last 2 or 3 decades. Mid-70s, yes, and after that a long time, and now this government activity that's taking place is tremendous. Mr. Kant mentioned about federalism in the states, and actually you can see that narrative changing as well. Again, it's work in progress. We've had some real good examples of how there is much more partnership already at the state level between business and the government. So it's no longer opaque, it is discussions. So it's not only the mega events that are held. I think what's important is that at the level of the bureaucracy, it's changing. But this will take time to change because mindsets have to change right across, and we must understand that. Mr. Kant mentioned about the domain. Actually, there are 3 pillars really that if we are permitted and we can speak about later. One is the domestic ecosystem, which needs to be changed. But firms also need to understand that there is firm level competitiveness that needs to make firms competitive inherently and must not go back to the government as the firms have been used to for special exemptions, etc. Firms have their work to ensure that productivity, quality, cost, safety indicate global competitiveness. And finally, the global ecosystem, which if we can speak about later, which is on free trade agreements and how we become part of the global supply chain. I believe some work needs to be done there as well. So just some opening remarks.
All very good points, sir, and we'll definitely come back to that. Mr. Kripalu, over to you.
So from my perspective, absolutely. I think we can see green shoots in the economy through the Make in India slogan and the narrative. And I think that is particularly evident where I think the center has a higher influence on what is happening on the ground. Now, one of the things, Mr. Kant, you said is that ultimately a lot of the execution needs to happen in the states. And just, talking about my industry, spirits, and I'll talk later about how important it is with the youth and the young profile of the population and the kind of role we can play for them. But in our industry, at the state level, an industry that's highly regulated, an industry that pays, or a company that pays 3.5 billion pounds of taxes in a year, we have not seen that change on the ground. And bringing in the governance standards that we have on the back of foreign investment into India, I must say, actually, it's gone a bit backwards in terms of how difficult it is to run our business. And I understand that alcohol is a state subject and the center stays out of alcohol. But to whatever extent, particularly in the states that are more aligned to the central leadership, on how we can drive influence to a company and to an industry that actually already makes in India. 95% of what we sell is made in India. And if some of these shackles can be removed, I would say we could make a whole lot more in India. And I want to just leave that thought with yourself and for people to consider.
And we'll definitely come back to them, Anand, as we go along. Mr. Simpkins, all yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the Make in India policy is a very, very powerful tool and mechanism to deliver the correct technology and capability to the Indian defense industry and create long-term skilled jobs. And I congratulate Mr. Kant in his efforts to deliver that program. For us, it has changed the landscape considerably. I've been involved in India for about 8 years. 8 years ago, I was a business development manager for India. And when we looked at RFIs and RFPs in those days, we would look at the corporation and our business units and find product to sell. Partnering probably was not even secondary. It was lower down the list. Today, the biggest change is when the RFIs and the RFPs come in, our first thought is, can we make this in India? And then we address our business units with that messaging. So that has been a fundamental mind shift in the way that we approach business. I would say when I look at my prospect list, 95% of the prospects are have a Make in India angle to it through partnering and JVs. The last 18 months, we've seen files move. We've seen approvals. This is a big change from years before. Our premier program in India is, as you've said, our Hawk Jet program with Hindustan Aeronautical Limited. We're very proud of the long-standing relationship there. We build Hawk aircraft here in this country faster than we do in our plants back in the UK and to the same high quality. That relationship has matured and developed through the years that we're at a point now where we are in discussion and contemplation with Hindustan Aeronautical where we will develop further that aircraft platform. We will upgrade it, not only for India, but for the world. So we're looking already and contemplating export out of India. I think changes that would help improve. We've had a great start with Make in India. For us, I think when you look at the private sector, both in India and globally, there are very few players in my sector in defense who can afford to develop product and sustain the longevity of the campaigns in India. It's one of the key factors and one of the biggest difficulties I have is selling to the boards in the UK and the USA to have the faith in India and stay the distance. So I think one of the biggest things I would be looking for is for the period of tendering to reduce, greater transparency, cut the red tape in that area. Other changes which would help would be offset policy. Offset policy has advanced fantastically. It's very mature, but there are things within the offset policy that we can improve. The period of performance, the limitations of delivering offset through only the OEM and the tier one vendors, if that could be expanded to the supply chain, the full supply chain and global corporate entities would be a massive change. A lot of these changes are in, Mr. Singh's executive committee report, and I commend that report.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Mark. That was very useful. Let me turn to you, Nikhil, very quickly. You've had experience in startups, and Mr. Kant mentioned startups as part of his opening address. Clearly, it has a huge role to play in this overall Make in India, and plus the overall growth story in India. What is your take specifically with respect to startups and new ventures coming through? Are they participating? Is this making a difference with Make in India?
Yeah, thanks, Anand. Specifically, if you look at startups, I think one of the things that the Make in India campaign did, and did it wonderfully well, which was the need of the hour at that point in time, was bringing in sectoral focus. Right. When the campaign was launched, there were 25 identified sectors. And it was said that these 25 sectors are going to take India into the next, critical growth phase. I think that is what has spurred startups and enabled everyone to understand that there is scope to build and run a business in this country. Now, a lot of people tell me that, whilst the Make in India campaign had come in, and Mr. Kant himself just mentioned that, obviously there is a lot of effort that has gone into make things easier. You go to any startup entrepreneur and you ask him or her, how easy is it? They would say, I'm just doing it. I am not interested in figuring out whether it is tough or not. This is pure, indomitable Indian entrepreneurial spirit. I have the spirit, I have to make it happen. So I am not bothered whether there are 22 licenses required or 4 required. If the government gets them down to 1, fantastic. But we are here to make India into a global powerhouse by, specifically looking at these sectors and introducing this kind of entrepreneurial culture. I think that is something which we can definitely pick up, from the UK, because they have, kind of through the Industrial Revolution, pioneered the entrepreneurial spirit, which we need to imbibe, which we are possibly, kind of looking at today. In the first half of 2015, angels and startup funding organizations have funded $3.5 billion USD in reported 380 deals. So, for the pessimism that comes across from a lot of corners saying that, there's not much, walk into any startup in any part of this country, and you will know what spirit is it with which people are working. Yes, we finally have, and I'm maybe saying this more as a remark, that the Prime Minister's overall initiative to bring in focus has been responsible to create a lot of energy. And I think the top part of what Mr. Amitabh Kant did by, kind of inaugurating and, launching Make in India, like he's done Incredible India, as well as, how he brought Kerala into the world map by, rechristening it as God's own country, is that there was a focus, as well as a very clear-cut guideline that, yes, now the objective is to make in India for the world. I think that is what to me would be the best part. In terms of the changes, I think there's no change required from my side. The only thing is, as Mr. Kant mentioned, this competition between states is an absolutely fantastic idea. It is possibly the best things that can happen, in terms of creating more competition for the states to, kind of whine. We have just read, recently on how Foxconn and how the entire bureaucracy of the government of Maharashtra was, engaged to get that deal. So the hunger is showing. The second thing that I could just recommend is that from a sectoral perspective, it might make sense to see which sectors have done well. And as we move forward, potentially 25 can move to 30 if we believe there are 5 sectors that we missed out.
Fair enough. No, thanks for that energy again, Nikhil.